The United States has been through 12 major economic crises, and every single one of them follows the same pattern. Someone gets greedy, the system breaks, and the government scrambles to clean up the mess. From two bankers nearly destroying the economy before the country even had a functioning military, to a global pandemic wiping out a decade of growth in 4 weeks. These are all 12 US economic crises fully explained, starting with the one that invented the bailout, the Panic of 1792. The year is 1792. The United States is 3 years old, and two New York bankers have already figured out how to break the entire economy. William Dewar and Alexander Macomb tried to corner the market on US debt securities. Their plan was simple: borrow insane amounts of money, buy everything, manipulate prices upward, cash out rich. It didn't work. Both defaulted, and security prices crashed over 20% in weeks. But here's where it gets worse. The Bank of the United States, instead of stabilizing anything, slashed its cash reserves by 34% and refused to renew nearly a quarter of its outstanding loans. Borrowers forced into mass sell-offs drove prices down even further. So now you've got a country that barely exists, a banking system in freefall, and zero precedent for what to do. Enter Alexander Hamilton. The Treasury Secretary personally authorized purchases of public debt and flooded banks across the Northeast with cash to stop the bleeding. By September 1792, the market had fully recovered. What Hamilton did that spring established lender of last resort principles, the same framework still used today. The country was barely walking, and he'd already invented the government bailout. But if you think the US learned its lesson, the Panic of 1819 would like a word. The Panic of 1819. After 1792, Americans might have thought they understood financial crises. They didn't, because the Panic of 1819 wasn't some backroom scheme by a handful of speculators. It was the first time the entire country felt an economic collapse, and nobody saw it coming. Here's the setup. The Napoleonic Wars had wrecked Europe's farmland, so American farmers were exporting everything: cotton, wheat, corn, tobacco. Prices soared. Land speculation went absolutely insane. Public land debt exploded from $3 million in 1815 to $17 million by 1818. And the Second Bank of the United States was happily accepting payments in banknotes that were barely worth the paper they were printed on. But then Europe's harvests recovered. India started undercutting American cotton exports. And in January 1819, cotton prices dropped 25% in a single day. The Second Bank made everything worse. After years of easy money, they suddenly strangled credit, calling in loans and demanding hard currency that nobody had. Land values collapsed 50 to 75%. Banks foreclosed on farms across the country. Large-scale urban unemployment spread for the first time in American history. And here's where it gets political. President Monroe looked at all of this and essentially shrugged. He treated it as a narrow monetary problem, told the government to spend less, and moved on. That decision created a wave of political resentment among ordinary Americans who had just lost everything. People who had never cared about economics suddenly cared deeply, and that anger didn't fade. It fueled Jacksonian populism for the next 2 decades and permanently changed how Americans related to their government. But if 1819 proved that structural forces could destroy an economy, the next crisis would prove that political ideology could make it even worse. The Panic of 1837, Andrew Jackson hated banks, genuinely despised them. So he killed the central bank, then signed 2 pieces of legislation that accidentally triggered one of the longest depressions in American history, nearly 7 years of economic collapse. For context, that's longer than the Great Depression, but here's the thing. Before everything fell apart, the economy was booming. Silver was flowing in from Mexico and China. Land prices were surging. Cotton was king. It looked like endless growth. Then Jackson signed the Specie Circular of 1836, which mandated that all public land had to be purchased with gold or silver coin, not bank loans. The problem? Nobody had enough hard money to pay the inflated bubble prices. The real estate market cratered overnight, but that wasn't even the killing blow. His Deposit and Distribution Act moved federal revenues out of East Coast commercial banks and into politically favored pet banks scattered across the West. That drained gold and silver reserves from the financial centers that actually needed them, forcing major banks to restrict lending at the worst possible moment. And then the rest of the world piled on. The Bank of England tightened credit. Wheat crops failed from Hessian fly and winter kill. European demand for American goods evaporated completely. Every safety net snapped at once. On May 10th, 1837, New York City banks ran out of gold and silver entirely. They suspended specie payments, refusing to redeem commercial paper at face value. The financial system just seized. Over 40% of all US banks failed. Deflation in wages and prices dragged on from 1837 to 1844, and the collapse collapse spread across the Atlantic, hammering creditors in Britain and the Netherlands. This was the moment the world learned that American financial chaos doesn't stay in America, and that depression lasted 7 brutal years. But compared to what came next, it was just a warm-up. The Panic of 1873. Before 1929, this was the Great Depression, literally. That's what people called it for over 50 years until a worse one came along and stole the name. So yeah, the crisis we're about to cover was so catastrophic it held the title of worst economic disaster in American history for half a century. But here's the part that makes this one fascinating. It didn't start in America. On May 9th, 1873, the Vienna Stock Exchange collapsed after a speculative bubble in European rail and real estate imploded. The financial contagion crossed the Atlantic within months, and when it arrived, it found the perfect target. J. Cook & Company, one of the most powerful banks in the country, had bet everything on selling Northern Pacific Railway bonds. They couldn't move them. In September 1873, the bank collapsed, and the chain reaction was so severe that the New York Stock Exchange shut down for 10 days. That had never happened before. But here's where it gets interesting. One of the unexpected contributors was the Suez Canal. Opened in 1869, the canal should have been a win for global trade, but sailing vessels couldn't navigate it because of Mediterranean winds, which devastated Britain's warehouse trade and tightened credit globally right as American rail speculation was peaking. So you had European financial contagion, a banking collapse, and a global credit squeeze all hitting at once. The numbers are staggering. Within 2 months, 55 railroads failed. By the 1-year mark, 60 more went bankrupt. New rail construction plummeted from 7,500 miles of track in 1872 to just 1,600 by 1875. 18,000 businesses collapsed. Bank reserves in New York City fell from $50 million to $17 million in a single month. Its unemployment hit 8.25% nationally, with a quarter of New York City's workforce out of a job. And if you think that sounds bad, the next crisis made this one look like a warm-up, Sefferdime. The Panic of 1893. Before 1929, this was the worst economic disaster America had ever seen, and the numbers prove it. Unemployment hit 25% in Pennsylvania, 35% in New York, and an almost incomprehensible 43% in Michigan. Nearly half the state wasn't working. But here's where it gets complicated, because this crisis didn't start in America. It started in Argentina. Barings Bank had overinvested in Buenos Aires, then a wheat crop failed. Then a coup failed, and suddenly nervous foreign investors started yanking their gold out of the US Treasury like the whole country was about to go under. Domestically, the accelerant was railroads. Investors had massively overbuilt American railways throughout the 1880s, and on February 20th, 1893, the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad declared bankruptcy. First domino. Then on May 5th, the Dow Jones fell 24% in a single day after the National Cordage Company collapsed, one of the worst intraday crashes in market history. The McKinley Tariff of 1890 had already disrupted trade by jacking rates as high as 50%, so the economy was already limping before the floor gave out. Over 500 banks closed, 15,000 businesses failed, soup kitchens opened across the country, people chopped wood and broke rocks just to eat. In some cases, women resorted to prostitution to feed their family. This wasn't a recession, this was survival. But here's the part that reframes everything. The US Treasury was so broke, so completely drained of gold, that President Cleveland had to go hat in hand to JP Morgan and the Rothschild banking family and borrow $65 million in gold just to keep the federal government solvent. The United States of America on its knees, borrowing from a private banker to survive. And somehow, that's not even the most unbelievable financial crisis involving JP Morgan. The Panic of 1907. By 1907, America's financial system had a ticking time bomb sitting right in the middle of it. Trust companies, these state-chartered institutions that competed with banks for deposits, held roughly 5% of their deposits in cash reserves. National banks held 25%, 5 versus 25, but depositors at trust companies could demand their money back in cash at any time. So you had institutions sitting on almost no cash, holding the door wide open for anyone who wanted to withdraw. That's not a business model, that's a dare. The fuse got lit when a group of speculators tried to corner the market on United States Copper Company stock. The scheme collapsed and the contagion spread fast. Within days, it reached the Knickerbocker Trust Company, New York City's third largest trust. Crowds lined up from the moment the doors opened, and by the end of the day, the Knickerbocker was dead. But the real crisis was just starting. Banks refused to lend to anyone. one. Interest rates on broker loans shot to 100%. Stock prices collapsed to levels not seen since 1900. The entire system was seizing up, and then one man stepped in. J.P. Morgan, in his 70s, Oz essentially became the Federal Reserve before it existed. He personally examined bank books, decided which institutions were solvent, and locked trust company presidents in a room until 4:45 in the morning, refusing to let them leave until they agreed to provide millions to keep the Trust Company of America alive. Morgan lost $21 million of his own money during the panic, saved the country, lost a fortune, got blamed for it. But the panic of 1907 made one thing painfully obvious. You cannot run a modern financial system on the personal authority of one aging banker. The fact that America's entire economy depended on whether J.P. Morgan felt like staying up past midnight was not a system. It was an accident, and it directly led to the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Of course, having a central bank doesn't mean you use it correctly. And what came next would prove that in the most devastating way imaginable. The Great Depression, this is the one, the benchmark, the crisis that every other economic disaster in American history gets measured against, and none of them come close. On October 24th, 1929, Black Thursday, 12.9 million shares were traded in a single day of pure panic, but the market wasn't done falling. 5 days later, Black Tuesday hit, and 16.4 million shares changed hands as the bottom fell out entirely. But here's the thing, the crash itself wasn't the catastrophe, it was just the opening act. From 1929 to 1933, real GDP fell 29%, consumer prices dropped 25%, wholesale prices collapsed 32%, and unemployment hit 25%, which meant 12.83 million Americans had no work and no prospects. But the numbers alone don't capture what made this crisis uniquely devastating. Nearly 7,000 banks failed between 1930 and 1933. That's a third of the entire U.S. banking system gone, and federal deposit insurance didn't exist yet, so when your bank failed, your savings didn't get frozen or restructured. They vanished. Every dollar you'd ever saved, just gone overnight, and the collapses fed on themselves in a way that's genuinely terrifying to think about. When a local bank went under, it didn't just take people's money, it took decades of accumulated knowledge about who in that community was creditworthy. Surviving businesses in those regions couldn't get loans at any price because nobody was left who knew which borrowers were reliable. The financial collapse became an information collapse, and that accelerated everything. The human reality was staggering. Hoovervilles, shantytowns built from packing crates and abandoned cars, spread across the country. Great Plains families, crushed by both the Depression and the Dust Bowl, abandoned their farms and migrated to California chasing survival. Unemployed teenagers rode the rails as hobos. Factories shut, farms foreclosed, mines went silent. By March 4th, 1933, when Roosevelt was inaugurated, the banking system had fully collapsed and prices had fallen to a third of their 1929 levels. His response was the New Deal, a scrambled alphabet of recovery programs, the CCC, TVA, FERA, WPA, NRA, programs targeting agriculture, infrastructure, employment, financial reform, all of it thrown at the wall simultaneously because nobody had a coherent playbook. But in Keynes's general theory wouldn't even be published until 1936. They were improvising in the dark, and full recovery never came during the 1930s. It took World War II to finally close the gap. The greatest economic crisis in American history wasn't solved by policy or theory. It was solved by global conflict. But if the Depression proved that an economy could collapse from the inside out, the next crisis proved something arguably scarier, that a handful of foreign governments could bring America to its knees overnight. The 1973 oil crisis. Every crisis we've covered so far started inside the American financial system. A bank collapsed, a market crashed, speculators got greedy, but this one came from the outside, and it proved that the world's largest economy could be brought to its knees by a single phone call from Riyadh. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel, attempting to recover territories lost during the 1967 Six-Day War. The U.S. responded by sending $2.2 billion in military support to Israel, and that's when the Arab oil-producing nations decided to make America pay for it. On October 20th, 1973, Saudi Arabia placed a total embargo on oil shipments to the United States. By November, oil exports from the Middle East to the West were down 60 to 70%. Japan and Western Europe, which imported 75% of their oil from the region, were equally crippled. But here's where it gets painful for everyday Americans. The price of oil went from $2.90 a barrel before the embargo to $11.65 by January 1974. That's a 300% increase. In today's dollars, that's the equivalent of oil jumping from $17 to $61 a barrel overnight. The average retail price of a gallon of regular gasoline rose 43%, from 38.5 cents in May 1973 to 55.1 cents by June 1974. Gas lines stretched around entire city blocks. Rationing kicked in across the country. And here's the part that made it even worse. The dollar had already been devalued in the early 1970s, which created a brutal feedback loop. A weaker dollar made oil even more expensive for Americans, which accelerated inflation, which weakened the dollar further. There was no speculator to arrest, no bank to bail out, no stock exchange to shut down for 10 days. Just a foreign policy decision, and suddenly the most powerful nation on earth was rationing gasoline like it was wartime. The embargo officially ended on March 18th, 1974, when King Faisal lifted it, but oil prices never came back down. The era of cheap American energy was over permanently, and the country was about to learn that when your economy runs on something you don't control, everything is borrowed time. But if the oil crisis proved the economy could be held hostage from the outside, the next disaster proved it could eat itself from within. The savings and loan crisis. Savings and loan associations had one job: take in deposits, lend out mortgages, collect the spread. Simple, boring, profitable. But here's where it gets complicated. S&Ls borrowed short-term through deposits and lent long-term through fixed-rate mortgages. So when the Federal Reserve jacked interest rates through the roof in the late 1970s to crush inflation, every single one of those long-term mortgage portfolios lost massive value overnight. The money coming in from old mortgages was worth less than what they owed depositors. Their net worth just evaporated. Now, a sane response would have been to let the weakest ones fail and restructure the rest. Congress had a different idea: deregulation. The 1980 Depository Institutions Deregulation Act raised federal deposit insurance from $40,000 to $100,000 per account, while simultaneously letting S&Ls expand into commercial real estate and riskier lending. Think about that for a second. They took an industry that was bleeding out and handed it a government-backed credit card with no spending limit, and the results were exactly what you'd expect. Between 1980 and 1986, S&L's residential mortgage holdings dropped from over 80% of their assets to less than 60%. All that money went into speculative commercial real estate, funded entirely by federally insured deposits. They were gambling with the government's money, and if they lost, taxpayers picked up the tab. But here's the part that makes your blood boil. The Reagan administration cut thrift examinations by 26% between 1981 and 1984. Regulators were literally looking the other way while the industry burned, and fraud was everywhere. Thrift officers paid themselves enormous salaries, charged origination fees on junk loans they knew would default, colluded with developers to book fake profits, and just kept extracting cash until their institutions went bankrupt. Then they walked away and handed the bill to the American public. Texas was ground zero. In 1988, the peak year of failures, more than 40% of all thrift collapses nationwide happened in Texas alone. By the time Congress finally stepped in with the Financial Institutions Reform, Recovery, and Enforcement Act of 1989, the damage was catastrophic. They abolished the main S&L regulator entirely, created the Resolution Trust Corporation to clean up the wreckage, and closed 747 institutions holding over $407 billion in assets. The final bill to taxpayers by 1999 reached $123.8 billion. Over 1,000 banks destroyed, all because deregulation was supposed to be the cure, and instead it just gave the disease a bigger host. But if the S&L crisis proved that deregulation without oversight was a disaster, the next crisis proved that irrational optimism could be even worse. The dot-com bubble, the late 1990s internet boom, was, on paper, the greatest wealth creation event in market history. Between 1995 and March 10th, 2000, the NASDAQ composite rose 600%. 600. And the logic driving it was so beautifully, hilariously circular that it almost deserves respect. Here's how it worked. Venture capitalists funded startups with zero revenue. Analysts recommended buying those startups. Retail investors piled in, not because the companies were worth anything, but because they figured someone else would buy the stock for more tomorrow. And for a while, that actually worked. The NASDAQ rose 86% in 1999 alone, peaking at 5,048 on March 10th, 2000. But here's what made the whole thing possible. After long-term capital management collapsed in 1998, the Federal Reserve cut interest rates and flooded the market with cheap money. When money is that easy to get, people stop asking whether a company will ever turn a profit. They just buy. The AOL Time Warner merger became the crown jewel of this insanity. A dial-up internet internet company merging with one of the largest media conglomerates on earth, and the market treated it as proof that the old rules of valuation were dead. Then March 2000 hit, and reality came collecting. The Nasdaq fell 78% from its peak by October 2002, erasing every single gain made during the bubble. Tokyo's Mother's Market, Seoul's Kosdaq, Frankfurt's Neuer Markt, London's Techmark all collapsed in sympathy. The mania had gone global, and so did the pain. But here's the part that rarely gets talked about. The human cost landed hardest on recent graduates who had accepted job offers at startups that evaporated before their first day of work. Many left tech entirely. Others never recovered their career trajectory. Insiders called them a lost generation, people who permanently earned less because of timing they couldn't control. The Nasdaq wouldn't reach a new all-time high for 15 years. Not until April 2015. 15 years to get back to where it started. If you think that level of financial destruction couldn't get worse, the next crisis proved it absolutely could. The Great Recession. For years, banks handed mortgages to people who never would have qualified for them, and the justification was simple. Home prices always go up, so if a borrower can't pay, they refinance or sell. That was the entire theory. Not a backup plan, not a safety net. That was the foundation holding up trillions of dollars in lending, and then home prices stopped going up. In April 2007, New Century Financial, one of the biggest subprime mortgage lenders in the country, filed for bankruptcy. Mortgage-backed securities got mass downgraded to high risk almost overnight. The subprime lending market seized up completely, home prices started falling, and foreclosures began spreading like wildfire. By summer 2008, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the two institutions that essentially were American mortgage finance, had to be seized by the federal government. But the real earthquake hit on September 15th, 2008. Lehman Brothers filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, the largest in U.S. history. It's involving more than $600 billion in assets. The Dow dropped 4.5% in a single day. JP Morgan Chase had to funnel $138 billion in Federal Reserve-backed advances just to manage the fallout. And here's where it gets truly bizarre. The next domino wasn't a bank, it was an insurance company. IG had written trillions in credit default swaps, essentially betting that the housing market would never collapse. When it did, AIG started imploding, and no bankruptcy framework even existed for a company that size. The Federal Reserve stepped in with up to $85 billion in emergency credit in exchange for a 79.9% equity stake. The United States government now effectively owned the world's largest insurer. Meanwhile, the human cost was staggering. 1. Foreclosure filings exploded from 717,522 homes in 2006 to 2,330,483 in 2008. The worst hit areas were California, Arizona, Nevada, and Florida, where Lee County, Florida alone reached a foreclosure rate of 12%. US GDP fell 4.3% peak to trough, making it the deepest recession since World War II. Unemployment more than doubled, climbing from under 5% to 10%, and full employment recovery took 47 months after the recession officially ended. Congress responded with TARP, originally authorized at $700 billion, later reduced to $475 billion. About $250 billion went to stabilize banks, $82 billion to the auto industry, $70 billion to AIG, and $46 billion toward foreclosure prevention. Total disbursed, $443.5 billion. But here's the part that surprises people. Total recovered, $425.5 billion. Always after interest, the net cost of the entire program was $31.1 billion. Not cheap, but a fraction of what the public assumes. Still, the damage was done. An entire generation watched their parents lose homes, retirement savings, and faith in the system. And if you think 2008 was a fast collapse, wait until you see what happened when the entire global economy shut down overnight. The COVID-19 recession. Every crisis we've covered so far took months or years to build. Bad loans piled up. Speculation ran wild. Warning signs flashed for quarters before the floor gave out. This one took weeks. In February 2020, the United States had record low unemployment. By the end of March, it was staring down the worst labor market since 1948. The stock market didn't slowly bleed out. It fell off a cliff. From February 12th to March 9th, the Dow lost nearly 20% of its value in 4 weeks. On March 9th alone, it dropped 2,013 points in a single session, the worst one-day point drop in the Dow's history, but it held the record for exactly 3 days. On March 12th, the day after the WHO officially declared COVID-19 a pandemic, the Dow fell 2,352 points, 10% gone in hours. But here's where it gets genuinely hard to believe. On March 16th, 2020, the Dow plummeted 2,997 points, points, a 12.93% single-day decline. That is a bigger percentage drop than the 12.8% crash on Black Monday in 1929, the day that kicked off the Great Depression. A single Monday in March 2020 was statistically worse than the day that started the worst economic catastrophe in American history. The job losses matched the panic. March of total civilian employment fell by 21 million from late 2019 to mid-2020. The unemployment rate tripled from 3.6% to 13%, the highest quarterly average ever recorded going back to 1948. At peak unemployment, 20.6 million Americans were out of work, far exceeding the 15.2 million unemployed at the worst point of the Great Recession. The federal response was historically fast and historically enormous. The Fed cut rates on March 3rd. The New York Fed offered $1.5 trillion in short-term bank loans on March 12th, and on March 25th, the Senate unanimously passed a $2.2 trillion stimulus package, the largest emergency economic intervention in American history. By November 2020, U.S. indices were back to January levels, a recovery measured in months, not years. Us powered by an unprecedented wall of government money, and that's the pattern this entire video has been building toward. Every crisis has been bigger, faster, and more globally interconnected than the last. Alexander Hamilton improvised $150,000 to stop the first one. It took $2.2 trillion to contain this one. The scale changes, the speed changes, but the cycle never does. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.